As Vatican officials gathered for what was supposed to be a closing speech on global climate initiatives, Pope Francis stood before the world not as a head of the Church, but as a man with something personal to say. His words were slow, deliberate, and trembling. The room, filled with political leaders and religious scholars, fell into a stunned silence when he veered off script. His voice lowered, his eyes darkened with emotion. And then, with the weight of a final breath, he said her name, Catherine, the Princess of Wales. In that single moment, the entire meaning of the event collapsed. Cameras shifted. Pens froze. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was something else, something deeper. The Pope wasn't making a symbolic gesture. He was telling the truth. A truth that didn't belong to protocol, headlines, or monarchy. It belonged to pain, to purpose, to a final act of clarity. He called her a symbol of courage, a quiet force of resilience. But what shocked the world wasn't the compliment. It was the urgency behind it. This wasn't admiration. It was a coded farewell, the kind you deliver when time is running out and silence is no longer an option. Why her? Why now? The questions stormed through newsrooms like wildfire. But then came the sentence that turned confusion into chaos. The Pope walks quietly, even when we don't recognize her doctors. The words landed like a riddle, subtle and strange. But to those who listened closely, it wasn't a slip, it was a signal. And behind closed doors, it hit like an earthquake. Within hours, journalists began digging. Medical sources started whispering, and a stunning thread began to unravel, a thread that tied the Pope's final days to Catherine's mysterious medical journey. What began as an emotional tribute was quickly turning into something else. A leak disguised as love. A confession disguised as poetry. The press tried to make sense of it, but insiders already knew this wasn't random. It was intentional. This was the Pope's final message. Not to the world, but to the few who could understand what he was really saying. And as global speculation exploded, the air around Buckingham Palace grew colder. They knew. The Vatican knew. And now the public was beginning to know. Behind Catherine's silence, and behind the Pope's trembling voice, there was a secret waiting to be exposed. But what the Pope said was just the beginning. The real story was still hidden in the shadows. One cryptic line opened a door into a secret no one was supposed to find. The Pope's mysterious mention of doctors we don't recognize didn't sound like much at first, just a poetic expression, perhaps lost in translation or meant for quiet reflection. But behind that phrase was a fuse, and once it was lit, the world watched as a firestorm of truth began to burn. Within 24 hours, investigative journalists weren't analyzing theology. They were chasing plain manifests, scanning hospital logs, and calling in every Vatican medical contact they had ever known. The question they were asking wasn't if the Pope meant something by that line. It was what he meant, and who he was trying to protect. That's when the pattern emerged, small but undeniable. Members of the Pope's elite Italian medical team, some of the most trusted and discreet surgeons in the world, had made several quiet trips to London in the months leading up to Catherine's surgery. No press coverage, no public record, just private flights and unexplained absences from Vatican hospitals. The dots were faint, but they were real. And for reporters who understood how tightly both the Crown and the Vatican guard their secrets, even the smallest overlap was enough to raise every alarm. Digging deeper, one name kept surfacing: a surgical consultant known only by his surname, revered in both Vatican and royal medical circles. Anonymous sources began to whisper the unthinkable, that the team responsible for prolonging Pope Francis's final months may have also been involved in stabilizing the future Queen of England. It sounded impossible, incompatible, but the timelines lined up with eerie precision. The Pope's condition deteriorated. Kate vanished from public view. Two worlds, an ocean apart, both began moving in silence under the care of the same hands. Officially, neither the Vatican nor Buckingham Palace would say a word. Press officers dodged questions. Medical institutions refused to comment. But the silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate, controlled, and that only fueled speculation. What kind of coordination would it take to embed a foreign medical team into a royal operation so private even British media didn't know the location? Why was there no leak, no slip, no mention until the Pope himself let it escape in the form of a riddle? As whispers turned into headlines, one thing became certain. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a collaboration. Quiet, strategic, intentional. Two of the most powerful institutions on Earth had silently joined forces in a way no one could have predicted. And what made it even more chilling was the complete lack of recognition, credit, or exposure. It was like they never expected the public to find out. Like the Pope, facing his own mortality, had decided to pull back the curtain just enough to raise questions, but not enough to answer them. And now, the world was left with one undeniable conclusion. Something profound had happened behind closed doors. Not just a moment of spiritual solidarity, but something clinical, tactical, life-altering. And as the investigation deepened, so did the mystery. If the Pope's doctors had been involved, if the palace had allowed this alliance to unfold in the dark, what else had been hidden? But the real question wasn't if they were connected. It was why. To understand why Pope Francis chose her, we must go back to where it all began. Before the palace gates, before the title, before the cameras followed her every step. Long before the world called her princess, she was simply Catherine Middleton, a quiet girl from Berkshire, raised not with grandeur, but with grounded values. Her parents, Michael and Carol, weren't aristocrats. They were flight dispatchers and cabin crew, ordinary people with extraordinary discipline, who taught their daughters something no institution could know: how to remain centered when the world tries to spin you out of control. There were no elite tutors preparing her for royalty, no grooming for diplomacy. What she had instead was quiet resilience, nurtured through structure, stability, and humility. She didn't chase the spotlight, but she didn't shrink from it either. As her family's modest business, Party Pieces, began to grow, Catherine stayed the same, helping where needed, observing quietly, never asking to be seen. That restraint would become the cornerstone of who she was, and later, what would draw the admiration of a dying pope. It wasn't destiny that led her to royalty, it was a quiet, deliberate shift. Catherine was originally accepted to Edinburgh, but during her gap year, something changed. She enrolled instead at St. Andrews, just months after it was announced that Prince William would attend. Critics later spun it as a move of calculation. But those who knew her knew better. She wasn't pursuing power. She was searching for something meaningful. What she found was far more complicated. Their first encounter wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't dramatic or romantic. It was awkward and quiet. Two students sharing a breakfast table. He was the heir to the throne. She was the girl from reading who blushed when their eyes met. That's where it started. Not with sparks, but with silence, with stillness. And from there, their bond grew the way most meaningful things do, slowly and away from the noise. Study sessions, walk through campus, lingering glances in the halls. A friendship before anything else. But life inside the royal perimeter is never truly quiet. Catherine would soon face her first crucible. In 2007, after years of loyal companionship, William ended the relationship with a single phone call. Just like that. The media pounced. Headlines screamed, "Dumped!" as Catherine was hounded through London by flashing cameras and manufactured pity. It was public humiliation, raw and undeserved. And yet, she didn't crumble. She didn't retaliate. She didn't retreat into bitterness or anger. She walked out of her home with her head high and her shoulders back, composed, poised, unbroken. That grace in the face of betrayal said more than any press statement ever could. It was the moment the world began to see her strength, not loud, not theatrical, but ironclad. William partied. Catherine went to Dublin. She didn't rebel. She simply continued. And when they reunited, it wasn't a royal fairy tale, it was two adults, quietly aware of the cost of love under scrutiny. What they built after that wasn't just a romance, it was a partnership, weathered and real. And when William proposed with his mother's sapphire ring on a secluded trip to Kenya, it wasn't a spectacle. Der vierte Jus Mandri. It was restoration. By the time she stepped into Westminster Abbey in 2011, the world saw a future queen. But Pope Francis saw something else. Not the gowns or jewels, but the woman who had endured heartbreak with grace. The woman who knew the value of silence and the cost of visibility. Her quiet strength and the ability to carry pain without parading it wasn't just admirable, it was sacred. But even the strongest spirits can be tested, and Catherine's test was only beginning. Behind the tiaras and titles, Catherine was fighting battles no one could see. The world saw her wedding, the fairy tale spectacle broadcast to billions. They saw the gown, the poise, the wave from the balcony. But they didn't see what followed. The pressure, the scrutiny, the impossible expectations crushing down with every breath she took behind palace doors. Almost immediately, the media turned. She was no longer the elegant bride they called her Lazy Katie, sneering at her, like royal schedule. Then came Weighty Katie, mocking her for taking her time with the engagement, as if patience were a flaw and not a sign of quiet strength. But Catherine didn't bite. She didn't retaliate with statements or stage-managed interviews. She did something far more dangerous in a world addicted to noise. She stayed silent. Because this was never about laziness. It was about strategy. While the press feasted on caricatures, Catherine studied. She observed the system from the inside. Where others scrambled to please or impress, she paused. She learned. She understood what those before her didn't. In this world, silence can be armor. And she wore it well. When Diana was thrust into the royal machine, she was consumed by it. But Catherine moved differently. She refused to be rushed, refused to be used. While critics counted her public engagements, she counted the steps required to survive. Only 34 royal appearances in her first year were an intentional choice, not a failure. She wasn't hiding, she was preparing, building emotional defenses, understanding the playbook, and quietly reclaiming what it meant to wear a crown. Her power wasn't in speeches or spotlights. It was in restraint, in the way she stayed grounded while the world demanded she float. And then came motherhood, where her defiance against tradition became undeniable. Royal mothers are expected to pose, delegate, and resume duties. But Catherine didn't just cradle a title, she cradled her child. When Prince George was born, she didn't return to Kensington or lean on royal nannies. She packed up her newborn and went home to her parents' modest house in Bucklebury. 6 weeks. No staff, no press. Just a mother learning the rhythm of sleepless nights and bottle feeds in the place she first learned how to stand tall. It wasn't a rebellion. It was reinvention. Catherine was rewriting what it meant to be royal, not by dismantling it with noise, but by reshaping it in silence. She knew tradition was a weight, not a crown. And instead of trying to carry it the old way, she carried it on her own. One quiet act at a time. One moment of grace against 1,000 flashes. She wasn't trying to impress the world. She was trying to survive it. And this is what Pope Francis saw. Not the headlines, not the gowns, but the woman who never shouted, never demanded attention, and yet commanded respect. A leader who didn't roar from the podium but whispered through action. She was, in every sense of the word, dignified. And that dignity, that quiet revolution, was why the Pope saw in her not just royalty, but something sacred. But it wasn't what the cameras saw that changed the Pope's mind. It was what they didn't. While headlines screamed about palaces, Catherine walked into places no royal dared go. No press followed her into those damp, forgotten buildings where hope had long since expired. No palace aides announced her arrival. No cameras flashed. Just Catherine alone, quiet and unguarded, stepping into the margins of society with nothing to offer but her presence. Over the course of a single winter, she visited 12 homeless shelters across London. Not once did the press report it. Not once did the palace issue a statement. Because she never wanted them to. This wasn't about image. It was about impact. And in those hidden visits, she redefined what it meant to serve. These weren't ceremonial, handshakes or photo ops dressed as philanthropy. Catherine stayed. She sat on stained couches. She listened to mothers who'd run out of options, to children who didn't understand why their world had collapsed, to men broken by addiction, trauma, and silence. She asked questions no one else was asking, not because she was trained to, but because she cared. There was no entourage, no curated narrative, no award waiting at the end. There was only pain, and Catherine chose to walk toward it when she could have stayed comfortably in the spotlight. And it didn't stop there. Her work in early childhood development became more than just royal duty, it became personal conviction. She immersed herself in research, met with leading psychologists, sat with educators, and took notes like a student learning how to rebuild broken lives from the inside out. When others skimmed the headlines, she studied the root causes. She understood that the trauma lived in children wasn't just about poverty or abuse, it was about neglect, about systems that failed quietly and consistently. And she wasn't trying to fix it with donations or speeches. She was trying to understand it, to carry it, to respond with empathy, not ego. Mental health became her battlefield, not because it was trendy, but because it was invisible. Catherine stepped into schools, recovery centers, and trauma units not with a crown, but with compassion. She sat beside grieving mothers and confused teens, not to inspire headlines, but to offer something more rare: stillness. And it was in those moments, those invisible acts of service, that she left the deepest mark. The kind that couldn't be captured on camera. The kind that reshaped lives without ever needing a stage. Pope Francis didn't see her through a lens of royalty. He saw what the world had missed. In his final words, he spoke not of her titles or fashion or media charm. He spoke of this, of the unseen labor of a woman who had every reason to look away and instead chose to look deeper. She wasn't trying to be a saint, he said. She was trying to matter. And in doing so, she did something far greater than earn admiration. She earned trust from strangers, from survivors, and from a dying pope who recognized in her the rarest kind of power, the strength to serve when no one is watching. But even the quietest work can't stay hidden forever, especially when silence turns into suspicion. When Catherine disappeared from the public eye, the world demanded answers. For a woman whose presence had long been a symbol of poise and quiet strength, her sudden vanishing act sent shockwaves far beyond royal watchers. On January 17, 2024, the palace released a short, sterile statement that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had undergone planned abdominal surgery and would step away from public duties until after Easter. No details, no images, just a carefully crafted pause. And in that pause, a dangerous void opened. The kind the public doesn't leave empty for long. At first, people waited, give space, trusted the process. But weeks turned into months, and silence became suffocating. The absence stretched too far, and the vacuum it created pulled in speculation like a black hole. Rumors started as whispers in fringe tabloids that maybe the surgery had gone wrong. Maybe it wasn't abdominal at all. Then came the darker theories. Some claimed she had slipped into a coma. Others insisted a mental breakdown was being covered up. And then, inevitably, the noise turned cruel. Headlines questioned whether the princess had undergone drastic cosmetic surgery. The whispers no longer sought truth. They hunted for scandal. The storm hit its peak on March 10th, Mother's Day in the UK, when Kensington Palace released a photo meant to calm the hysteria. Catherine, seated with her 3 children, smiling gently. At first glance, it seemed like the reassurance the world was waiting for. But within hours, the image unraveled. The shadows didn't align. One child's sleeve was mismatched. A zipper vanished mid-frame. It was edited, and not subtly. The internet exploded. Professional photographers dissected the image with brutal precision. AI detection software flagged inconsistencies. The phrase "Kategate" took over social media like a virus. What was meant to soothe instead ignited fury. Major news agencies withdrew the image. Commentators accused the palace of deception. For the first time in decades, the royal family's credibility was bleeding in real time. And at the center of it all was a woman who hadn't said a word. The narrative twisted, violently. What was she hiding? Why the doctored photo? If everything was fine, why didn't she simply appear? The media frenzy spiraled into hysteria. People didn't just want answers, they demanded them. And the pressure wasn't limited to tabloids and talk shows. Government officials, public health experts, and even royal allies were cornered by questions they couldn't answer. Catherine's silence, once her greatest strength, was suddenly being weaponized against her. And yet, behind that silence was something the public couldn't see, something heavier than image control, something deeper than PR missteps. Catherine hadn't vanished out of fear. She was fighting. And the truth, the raw, heartbreaking truth, was coming. Then, in the middle of the storm, Catherine broke her silence. No one expected her to speak. But when she did, it changed everything. For months, speculation had suffocated the truth. Whispers turned to roars, facts twisted into conspiracies, and the woman who once defined dignity was now a mystery the world demanded to solve. But then, without warning, on March 22, 2024, a video appeared. No fanfare, no press conference, just Catherine, the Princess of Wales, seated, solemn, and heartbreakingly real. There was no royal backdrop, no curated statement, just her eyes, tired but resolute, staring straight into a world that had all but lost its patience. And in that stillness, she spoke. Calm, measured. Every word delivered not with grandeur, but with the rawness of someone carrying a truth too heavy to hide any longer. She confirmed what many feared, but no one truly expected. Post-operative tests had revealed cancer. She was now undergoing preventative chemotherapy. But what struck the world wasn't just the diagnosis, it was how she said it. There was no self-pity, no drama, just clarity, strength, vulnerability wrapped in composure. She didn't explain with statistics or medical jargon. She spoke of her children, of the delicate conversations she and William had quietly rehearsed, of the terror that came with telling young minds that their mother was sick. She thanked the doctors, the strangers who had respected her silence, the few who had seen behind. The curtain and chosen compassion over clicks. The impact was instant. Across the globe, outrage fell silent. Speculation crumbled into shame. And sympathy poured in not out of obligation, but out of collective reckoning. For once, the world didn't see a princess. They saw a mother, a woman, a human being stripped of all royal protection and yet still standing, still speaking. Online vitriol turned into messages of support. Newspapers that once fueled the fire now begged for forgiveness. And in clinics across the UK, something remarkable happened. Cancer screenings surged by 35%. One video, one voice, had shaken a nation into action. Not by command, but by courage. Some say Pope Francis watched the video in complete silence. That tears welled in his eyes as he heard her voice. Not because he was surprised, but because he finally saw the world understanding what he had already known. Catherine wasn't a figurehead. She wasn't just enduring. She was leading in the most human way possible. Her strength wasn't just in surviving the disease. It was in choosing the moment, in controlling the story when everything else had spiraled beyond control. And that act, that final reclaiming of her narrative, did more than restore public trust. It moved the heart of a dying pope. And just days later, the Pope made his final move, one that would rewrite both their stories. As the world watched, a dying Pope asked for something no one expected: mercy. The room was packed, the atmosphere somber yet composed. It was supposed to be another papal address, one of his final scheduled public remarks. The Vatican had called it a moment of reflection, but what unfolded stunned even those closest to him. In a fragile voice that betrayed the weight of his final days, Pope Francis began to speak not about politics, not about the church, not even about his own legacy. He spoke about her, Catherine, the Princess of Wales. Midway through the speech, he paused, not for breath, but for courage. Then, turning his gaze slowly to the crowd, he said her name aloud, not as royalty, but as a woman, a mother, a warrior. He called her a beacon of courage, a light in a time darkened by noise and cruelty. And then, for the first time in history, the Vatican openly acknowledged what had only been whispered in corners of the press. The Pope confirmed that the same elite medical team that had cared for him in his final months had also watched over Catherine, not as a favor, not as diplomacy, but as an act of shared humanity. He spoke not of procedure, but of presence. He had followed her journey, he said, quietly and closely. He had watched her suffer in silence, endure disgrace, and face an illness that threatened to shatter everything she'd spent years holding together. He praised her not for her title, but for her restraint, for her humility, for standing firm while the world collapsed around her image. And then he did what no one expected from the head of the Roman Catholic Church. He begged, not for healing, not for redemption, but for mercy, a plea to the media, to the public, to the world itself, to stop the cruelty, to stop chasing her in moments of weakness, to stop turning her dignity into spectacle. He warned that constant intrusion wasn't just harmful, it was lethal. That what Catherine needed now was not admiration from afar, but space to continue her recovery without the glare of 1,000 flashbulbs waiting to capture her next vulnerable moment. And as his voice broke, he elevated her legacy to something even greater. He said she had already saved lives not just by surviving, but by speaking. By breaking the silence, she had sparked a surge in cancer screenings, a surge in empathy, a surge in humanity. She wasn't just surviving illness, she was modeling resilience for a broken world. She had become something rare, he said. Not just a royal figure, but a symbol of grace under fire, of truth spoken quietly, of service carried out in the shadows. A model not for kings or queens, but for people. This wasn't a ceremonial blessing. This was a final act of spiritual reverence. The Pope's last plea wasn't political or performative. It was personal, it was urgent, and above all, it was honest. But what Pope Francis left behind wasn't just a tribute. It was a torch. She didn't need to raise her voice. She simply showed up, and that was enough. After everything, the silence, the illness, the doubt, Catherine re-emerged not with a royal declaration, but with a quiet presence that spoke louder than any statement. Her appearances are fewer now, measured and deliberate. But when she enters a room, people no longer see the future queen. They see the woman who stood tall when the world tried to tear her down. Her body is still healing, her energy carefully managed. Yet the weight of her presence is unmistakable. It's no longer about what she says, it's about what she's already endured and survived. There's a shift now, a deeper meaning behind each wave, each nod, each public engagement. Catherine has become more than a ceremonial figure. She has become a symbol, a quiet force of resilience. Not because she sought sympathy, but because she earned respect through grace under relentless pressure. She doesn't need to command attention anymore. She embodies something rarer dignity in its purest form. The monarchy, once criticized for being outdated and disconnected, now leans into her image as proof that quiet leadership still matters. That substance can still outlast spectacle. She isn't rebuilding the crown with speeches or revolutions. She's doing it with presence, with consistency, with the kind of strength that isn't declared but discovered usually in the darkest moments. Every small step she takes in public now feels larger than life, because behind that simple walk is a battle we all now know she fought privately. And behind that smile is a lifetime of holding things together without ever asking for applause. Pope Francis saw it. He saw it long before the world did. And in his final words, he didn't just honor her, he handed her something, a legacy not of doctrine, but of example. A torch not of tradition, but of truth. His last plea wasn't just about Catherine's recovery, it was about the future, about the kind of leaders we need, the kind who don't rely on spectacle to inspire, but who move mountains in silence. And that torch, quietly passed from a dying spiritual giant to a quietly recovering royal, now lights a path for something new, a different monarchy, one less obsessed with protocol and more rooted in people. Catherine's story isn't just about survival, it's about transformation, of herself, of her role, of what the crown could become if it follows her lead. She has rewritten the rules of power without ever challenging them out loud. No scandal, no rebellion, just quiet defiance, steady commitment, and an unshakable core. Her influence isn't measured in headlines, but in hearts changed, in the thousands who booked screenings, in the millions who saw strength where they expected weakness, in the silent recognition that she represents something enduring. And in the silence left by Pope Francis, the world is finally learning too. Listen, drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.